Hello, everyone. Thank you for so much for joining us. My name is Spencer Quong, and I'm the assistant editor of Poets and Writers magazine. For those of you not familiar with PNW, we're the bi-monthly publication of the nonprofit Poets and Writers. We publish profiles of notable authors, as well as articles that aim to help all writers navigate the publishing industry and find a literary community. So I'm very excited to be here tonight with Kristen Arnett to learn more about the writing process behind her latest novel, With Teeth, which came out last month from Riverhead. Kristen is also the author of the novel Mostly Dead Things and the story collection Felt in the Jaw. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, Guernica, McSweeney's, and she recently contributed a set of essays to our Craft Capsules series here at PNW. So with tonight's event, Anatomy of a Scene, we wanted to offer a closer look at the revision process and rough drafts that make a book possible. And I'm particularly excited to do this with Kristen because With Teeth felt, for me, so seamless and propulsive. And if you haven't started already, I hope this event will persuade you. But the novel follows a queer mother named Sammy who is struggling to raise her son Samson alongside an often absent partner. It's a portrait of her best attempts at intimacy with him and a reminder of how the ways in which we offer love can sometimes be misguided or even destructive. So Kristen will be walking us through a few scenes and screen sharing revisions. We'll have a conversation throughout, but we'll aim to leave time at the end for questions from the audience as well. So please do use the Q&A feature separate from the chat if something comes to mind. And the last thing I wanted to mention is that closed captioning is available in the toolbar at the bottom, and this event is being recorded. So with that, I should turn it over to you, Kristen. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for doing this with me. I was saying this to you in like the green room, but I was like, wow, I really learned a lot about myself and my writing process putting this together for tonight. Yeah, I have three different scenes that I feel like were like we talked about that I was like, I feel like would be good to kind of show like different kinds of process. I'm going to focus less on like grammatical stuff and more just like on intent and plot or like trajectory of narrative, which I think is more helpful, especially for myself. I mean, I think everyone's process is different, but like what we'll do is just kind of like do each one like on screen. I'll share whatever I wrote, including like early stage garbage, as I lovingly like to say, and then kind of come out and then talk a little bit, which I think will be really fun. And yeah, if you have questions, like please ask. I'm always open to like talking about any kind of thing. Do I know like what I'm talking about? No, or maybe, like who's to say, but like possibly. Okay, so let's start off like I feel like it's a good place to start off with, and With Teeth, like there's no spoilers in any of the things I'm going to show, but the first part that Spencer and I are going to talk about is like the opening portion of the book. And it opens with an attempted child abduction. And the scene that I'm going to show about revising is about like the 911 call that Sammy, the protagonist, makes after the attempted abduction takes place. So let me make sure that I can share it. Let's go ahead. Okay. Is it popping up for you?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, so I have up for you guys first. This is the initial draft. This is very scary, showing the initial draft of things that I have written. Like you all are now essentially my readers. So this initial draft has about her talking to the dispatcher. So Sammy told the dispatcher what happened and gave him the license plate number. She called it an attempted abduction. She described what the man looked like, what he'd been wearing. She told him about his two perfect teeth, how his truck had a CB radio. She hoped she remembered it right. She could barely remember her own name, how fast it all happened, too quick, it all sped by in a blur. Her son was leaning against the fence. He kept saying ants, ants, and then she felt them crawling up the legs of her shorts. She jumped off and dusted them off, then moved both of them around the corner to a grassy spot without any bugs. Her child found an abandoned straw from a fast food cup and she just let him play with it. She was going into shock. She could feel it. Her entire body was shutting down. She was still holding the woman's phone and knew she should call her wife, tell her what happened, but she couldn't remember that number either. So that was the initial draft of what I had. It's very removed. It's happening very quickly. which of course, a scene in like a child abduction would happen, like an attempted child abduction. This would be like a thing where it's like, can anybody keep their mind focused? Like, no, it would just be like an extreme state of panic, like what sits inside of there. So after talking, my editor at Riverhead, Cal Morgan, sent me some very good notes, particularly about this specific spot in the scene. And so when I show you guys what the revision looks like, it is expanded, but so much of it is like, yes, it's still happening in panic mode, but a lot of those kind of like wild questions that would happen in context with like, I don't know what I'm doing. I have to be present. I have to know what I'm doing. I still don't know what I'm doing. So this is the initial draft. And here's the edited version of that draft that we'll like move through together. So it still has that same stuff up front, right? It's like, here's the license plate number. She called in an attempted abduction. She described CB radio, what she remembered, how fast it all happened, too quick, all sped by in a blur. After hanging up, she realized she hadn't taken down any information. She didn't know the dispatcher's name. She'd been talking to a woman, at least she thought it had been a woman in that high-pitched voice. Sammy hadn't given them a number so they could contact her because she's using somebody else's phone. How would they reach her? Would she need to call back again and talk to someone else, someone new, give out the information all over again? Already the license plate number had flown from her brain. This is like the interiority that's still happening, but instead of being like so quickly passed over, which is like my initial impulse was to be like, let's shorten this, let's make this really tight, was just like, this is still tight, right? Like it's still doing like that tight kind of quick movement, but it's like happening with a kind of like manic feeling in your head, right? Where it's like you're asking yourself these kinds of questions where it's like, I'm using someone else's phone. I don't know who I was talking to. Do I like need to know like what I need for a follow-up? I'm ill-equipped to do that. So that interiority is still kind of there and kind of like functioning, but still very speedy in a process. It adds like maybe half a paragraph, right? But it's like, it adds like a lot. The second thing that added in was like, she jumped up and dusted the ants off of her pants, moved them both around to a corner. This like singular sentence that gets added in. I'm a Florida writer and I'm trying to write a book that's very specifically about place, that's about Florida. And it's like, yes, the ants are a big part of that, but also like what else is happening on the ground? It's like there were hundreds of dandelions peppering the grass, wild fluffy things that stirred in the breeze. Instead of touching those pretty things, move into her child picks up the straw with the dirt and starts playing with it. That kind of way I'm like incorporating, like I'm really trying to like also incorporate place so very deeply into this that it's like I just need a sentence to kind of embed us here and to see what we're doing, like place and time and like what's happening. And this is like a very specifically kind of like outside, we're like on a playground, specifically in Florida kind of thing to add into it. And a thing that got added in here, down here in this like teal color block is like the idea of like really like, let's add in like she couldn't remember her wife's number is like the thing that happened previously in the other draft, but the interiority of like, why don't I know my wife's phone number? She wondered, what if there was an emergency? So adding that kind of line in to Sammy where she's like, it adds in this idea of like the relationship that's also significant to the book, which is with her wife, Monica, adds in like a little more depth to it being like, and also this idea of like, what if there was an emergency when there's literally one happening in that moment? It gives us a lot about who Sammy is, I think, and also her relationship with her wife and how she feels like they are parsing a lot of things together. And so like, as you can see, the scene got significantly longer. I mean, not like hugely longer, but like it added in like a significant like chunk of text, which I think like added in things in a lot of different levels that felt like significant to me in terms of like plot and like narrative and like where we're headed. So I'll stop sharing for a second and then Spencer and I can talk a little bit more about like scene for this particular scene.
Yeah, I love those additions, and like you said, it's adding length, but the interiority still has the same quickness of the other parts of the scene. And I wonder if you ever have challenges matching tone in terms of what you've written before and then adding new material. Mm-hmm. How do you get back into the mindset of the scene that you were drafting originally?
Yeah. I mean, some of that stuff, I feel like the way that helps for me, and I know that everybody's process is like very different, and that's like why writing and like reading are so exciting, because like everybody is different and how they function in these kind of things. For myself, quite often in terms of editing, I need to read it aloud. I need to hear it, like actually hear it. When I hear it, I can hear the things that are missing or that would feel tonally appropriate, or the things that just like don't fucking work. Pardon my French. It's just this way of like you can hear when stuff like really lands like a dead weight. Like it's like this doesn't sit here, or this isn't who the person is. I can't do that in a draft, like an initial draft. I feel like when I try and do that, like then I get pretty stuck inside of a sentence or a paragraph or even a scene, and I'm like find myself revising and revising and revising to like in infinity. But when I'm going back through in revisions, that's when it's like I allow myself to sit a little more musically on the sentence level, maybe, where it's like how do like the words sit with each other, how do like things sound together, and so saying them aloud helps a lot with that. I feel like you can hear inconsistencies when you say stuff aloud. Like if you're saying like a lot of those paragraphs and then you say a sentence that sounds like really out of keep with like where the other stuff is, you immediately hear it and you call yourself out for it. Or at least that's what like my own particular participation is with like going through a draft. And it's usually awful. Like it's like a very bad feeling where you're like, that's where my worst like notes are to myself, where I'm like, wow, this is like really terrible. But it is like it's a thing for me where it's like, if I can hear it, then I can hear it like sounds like the same person saying it, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And how much did you know about the characters at this point, would you say? I also noticed that Samson, her son, isn't named in the scene, I don't think, right? So did he have a name at this point?
I actually think he might not be, but if he is, it's like very briefly.
Yeah.
This is a very good question. I already said this was going to end up being a therapy session, so it's like I feel like I knew very little, but I also feel like once again, like the way that I move through fiction, specifically like how I work in novels, is like I don't outline. I really like to be surprised in the ways that I encounter what's going to happen with characters. So what I knew about any of the characters was that I knew the most about Sammy, because I was like, this book and how it starts off is going to tell me a lot about who she is in relationship to the people in the world around her, and that's going to help me like the momentum moving forward through the book. So it's like if I can understand how she reacts to this very dire, very significant, awful situation, right? Like an attempted child abduction that's a horrible situation to be inside of. Like that's like, so like how does she react to it, and like what's her reaction to things, is like a way in which I was like, okay, this is going to get me in her head, and it's going to make me understand a little bit more about how she's reacting to the other people in her life. So I knew the most about her, the least about her wife, and like maybe middle ground about Samson, because Samson, I was like, this is going to be kind of like the rocker between the two of them. I was like, here's where we get Sammy. And Sammy, I'll be like very frank about like how I was approaching this book, where I was like, I really want her to be like ostensibly an unreliable narrator throughout this. And as a reader, as you're encountering this book, the more you realize that she's a little unreliable when it comes to relating her relationship to her son. So what we get about him is very much, because it's third person, but it's very close third person. And so we feel like what she's telling us is got to be truthful, or like her own truthful perspective. But it's very much colored by the idea that like everybody in a household is an unreliable narrator. So like what we're seeing is like what she's choosing to give us. So like I feel like the most I knew was about Sammy, and what I knew about Sammy was that she was unreliable.
Nice. So I'm just gonna move some things around. I will try to speak up also I'm seeing in the chat,
I'm
but it's
leaning
hard to
back
hear
here. So
me.
I'm gonna lean in. I'll lean in as well. I'll lean in
I think you're good. I think it's a me problem. I was also curious. So I heard you speak about this elsewhere, that you wrote this draft kind of all at once. And I wonder if you feel any sort of preciousness for like your first drafts, or do you just kind of let it go as soon as you start editing?
Yeah. I mean, I truly am like a person who is like, I'm a huge fan of deleting things. Like I am a person that's like, I love the idea of like, could we get rid of something? Like I'm like a person that's like, I don't feel like I'm too precious about like what's happening in a draft. Like thematically, like I'm excited about like where I feel like it's going in a direction. But I don't ever feel like I don't ever feel like if I have to like jettison something that's gonna like necessarily really compromise the work to a degree that it's going to really change the intent between like behind what I'm trying to do.
Mhm.
So the biggest thing for me was like this opening scene, this prologue that I read from was like, I'm here in the scene and I'm trying to be like very close to it because I want it to happen fast and it's going to tell me what's going on. And that definitely was the process of writing it. It did feel like word vomit where I was like, bleh, like here it is, like we're gonna like get it all out. Like, but like in terms of editing it, like I definitely didn't have the compulsion to be like, no, it's perfect, or
Mhm.
no, we need like it needs to stay the same. I was like, how can we like either tighten or expand in certain ways that like really enhances how I feel this character is moving through this particular awful moment in time, because I think there's a lot of ways that you can approach it, but I'm definitely a person that's always open to like how can we like examine like how we can shift it in different ways, because I also think the different ways that you can edit it, like you can edit things in a lot of different ways and have it do a lot of different things. So I'm always interested in like what other kinds of shapes it can take, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Were there many drafts in between the ones that you showed us, would you say?
Um, no, like there was like there were not, because I feel like I'm also like my own worst critic. So
Mm.
I feel like as many of us are, I think. So going through this particular draft before I even sent it out, I was very harsh and just like sat with it and like went through it and went through it and went through it and went through it. I was on a deadline, which that informs a lot of how we like move through drafts, I think, where it's like, right, where it's like you only like there's a finite amount of time that you can like mess around with something. And that was definitely like where I was with this draft before I sent it off to my editor, where I was like, you have this finite space that you can like mess around with it. Because sometimes I think too, it's like, I mean, I can only speak for myself, where it's like when I get down to things, I start getting down to sentence level or like the nitty gritty or like word choice or like, why did you choose that word? Can't you like flourish or like, right, kind
Mhm.
of peacock a little bit? Like, right, like make things a little more beautiful or make things a little more scenic or like, can you do this kind of thing? And so, like, you do that enough times and then you're like, okay, you're like kind of stalling before you're trying to send it off to an editor. And really it needs to be like the kind of like meat and potatoes like underneath before you
Mhm.
add in all the other kind of garnish. Please don't quote me on that.
No, that sounds right to me. Um, should we do scene number 2?
Yeah, that's it. This will be fun. Okay, so I'm in a screen share again. This secondary scene is a little later on in the book. It's when Samson is in 4th grade and Sammy has taken him, he's in swim classes, he's excelling at swimming. And she has taken him over to this woman's house, who it's a woman she's met at like the kind of swim practices, whose daughter is also in swim classes. And they're kind of having maybe this like kind of romantic thing going on, maybe like a tryst or something. And Sammy decides to do this, even though she's married. She brings her kid over there and doesn't like contact her wife. And like they're at this woman's apartment. So the kids are playing. The ladies are outside on like a little balcony, like a shitty balcony out in like a Florida apartment, and like kind of making out. And then a scene happens with a cat. And so I'm gonna screen share again. I really like how I have called this, let's see, I think I called it Flying Cat.
Mhm.
If you can see it here. So this is like the end of this chapter, which is like, I wonder if I could get drunk from her breath alone, Sammy wondered, and that's when the cat sailed directly overhead. It yodeled, high-pitched and wailing like a baby might, and then down and up. The gray cat flung up over them as the two women separated, broke apart like repelled magnets. Now there was other noise too, Serena, the other kid. In the living room, Lenore, the other woman, yelling over the balcony rail, the cat's screeching yowl. The only two who were quiet were Sammy and her son, Samson, who stood in the opening of the sliding glass door, her son with his arms still in the air as if he were mid-throw, as if he could call the cat back to him. So this is the ending of the initial chapter where there's the scene with a cat that ends up over the balcony railing, right? It's actually very small again, like pretty brief. We get a lot of things all at once, right? Like two ladies making out that shouldn't be, some kids there. Oh my God, here's a cat flying over the railing. Things are happening very quickly and in a lot of ways. So here's the initial draft. And then here's the edited version. And once again, it has expanded, but for a few different reasons that I, even looking through them, felt like was really important. I wonder if I could get drunk from her breath alone, Sammy wondered, and the sliding glass door squeaked open behind them. So not the cat flying overhead. Here's the door opening. And a lot of that was like, I need some scene setting happening here. I need to know, like, what are their bodies doing? Where are they? What's happening behind them? And then this green part right here is a new addition where I was like, I want to hear like, and like from some good input from my editor, Cal Morgan, who's at Riverhead, was like, you know, where are they? Like, where are they in space and time? Like, where are their bodies? And I was like, this is a good question, right? Like, if we're writing about like people making out or like a cat flying off a balcony, let's know where bodies are in space and time. So it was like adding this part in where it's like, here's where the bodies are functioning. Like, what are they doing? Here's some kids next to the sliding glass door. There's a cat. There's the two women. They were doing something they shouldn't be doing. What would two women be doing? Like, if they're like, what would their reaction be if they're doing something they're not supposed to? So they scrambled apart. Sammy's knees knocked the table as she hurriedly leaned back, and one of the cups overturned, splashing the ground, dripping onto her legs. Shit, Lenore muttered. It's giving some kind of like dialogue that it happens from like one of the other people, uselessly attempting to catch the spill with her hands. Her face was beet red with embarrassment. She wondered if her own face was that color too. What do you guys need? Sammy asked without turning around, breathing heavily. Her voice sounded wild. She just got done with a strenuous workout. And then this here is an insert from Samson. I was like, if we're going to have this cat have this interaction where it flies off, we need like input from Samson. Like, he's not a silent bystander. He's like part of like what's happening in the scene with what's going on with the cat. Like, the cat scratched me, Samson yelled. I hate this stupid cat. Right? Like, it's like his mom is doing some kind of thing that he doesn't understand. He's been forced into this household where like with a young girl who's supposed to be his friend through his mom that he doesn't know. It's like, what is his reaction to being put into this situation? And his reaction is like, I hate it. I don't like this cat. I don't like being here. I want to go home, but it's all kind of compartmentalized inside of this sentence, right? Right. I hate the cat. I don't like it. Then it was the cat who screamed, high-pitched and wailing like a baby. This was there before. The animal flew past in a gray and white blur and vanished over the side of the balcony. Sammy jumped up belatedly as if she might be able to prevent what had already happened, but the cat was long gone. Like, what happened with the cat? Did Samson touch it? You know, maybe, maybe not. It also puts a little bit more of like a mystery into like what's occurring inside the scene with the cat. And then there's like some more like human interaction with what's occurring, right? Like Serena, the other girl, is screaming. That's her cat. The woman, that's her house. Like, Lenore calls over the balcony and yelled at her daughter, telling her to shut up. That shows you her relationship with her daughter. and like what their relationship is like with each other. Only Samson stayed silent. He stared at her from the safety of the apartment, then turned and vanished back inside. So this is like a lot of different things happening, but with not that much more text added in. Like a lot of it was like, what's the human movement throughout this, right? Like what are people doing in this? And that was like very helpful to me in terms of a scene, because this previous scene was very much less like, what are people doing in this? It was like, here's the moment, a cat has moved over the balcony. Oh God, it's over. Like, wow, what a wild thing to have happen. And in this scene, like doing the editing, it was a lot like, what's each individual person contributing to this scene? Because this is a very, like if you're in a scene where like a cat who lives in an apartment jumps over a balcony, the cat lives. I don't know if that's a spoiler or not. The cat lives, cat doesn't die, cat's fine. There's no animals die in the course of this book. Well, there's like a fish that dies, but this cat is fine. It's like, I don't know, it was like adding in like, how is everybody's perspective? First of all, bodily movements, Samson having like an actual voice in terms of scenes, the cat moving, but then also like how the people all react to that cat doing that, because that felt significant. And that was like the way in which this scene obviously very much varied from the original one. Okay, I'll come out of the screen share now.
I love the new details, especially the bit about Lenore trying to catch the wine with her hands, which is just like so her. It's like this kind of hopeless character. Um, do you did you do a lot of character development for the minor characters like Lenore? Did you have a good idea of who they were, or did they feel like they were serving a purpose in a particular moment and then you let them go?
I think that they did double duty for me, and I thank them for that, because I do think that through first drafts and thinking about them, I thought a lot about them in terms of how Sammy's interacting with everybody, because she's so close up and it's like needing her perspective. So how she thinks everybody else is interacting with her feels the most significant, because she's a person, right, who doesn't feel like people are ever listening to her, but in reality, she's not listening to anyone else. Right. So I was like, I need this person to be here, but I only really at first need to think about the way that Sammy sees this person. But in revision and in follow-up, and especially the interstitials that I put throughout the book, I was like, I really want to know a little bit more about who this person is, because I truly think that any interaction between people of any kind, especially inside of a household, but also in any other kind of circumstance, is multiple stories, right? Like, even though you both had the same, like, right, like, okay, we were both pumping gas at the same gas pump, like, right, like I was at 4, you were at 2. Like, that's the story, like, right, that's where it sits. Like, your particular perspectives are different, right? Like what you're thinking in your head, how your life has been up to that point, like what's going on for you at that particular day, what your interaction is with that person and how you perceive them. Those things are all wildly different. So thinking about Lenore post thinking about Sammy was very much like, this is a person who has her own shit show going on. Like, is she a person like Sammy? Maybe, but like she has her own shit, and it's like Sammy doesn't necessarily care. So I think in terms of like starting off writing, like it became like a way in which I was like, you are a character that's here, you're like servicing and seen, but then very much became like, you're obviously a person who has your own story going on. It's just that like Sammy's so close up, like your story doesn't matter to her.
Yeah. Yeah, I also feel that way with like the revision with Samson, that it's giving him like a little bit more credit this time around. Like before he looks very guilty with his hands in the air, but this one's so much more ambiguous, which I really love, especially that last line that he just vanishes inside. It's very like demonic. How do you, I feel like a lot of the book is, very psychological, and it's a lot of Sammy kind of ruminating on how she's treated. And so I'm wondering how you decide on these moments to like really accelerate the action and not give her as much time to like narrate what's going on.
Oh wow. I wish I had like a really good solid answer for that. But it's usually like, since I don't like outline, it feels like sometimes things start happening for me in narrative action that I'm not anticipating. Um, so things that happen in this book, like anytime like something happened that felt like extremely aggressive or extremely like, oh, something's happening here. I felt like I was like in the middle of the scene before I was like able to discern. I was like, well, okay, well, this is happening, I guess. And then I was dealing with the fallout of that happening.
Yeah.
But maybe that's because like, I mean, I feel like I write towards messy characters or characters who are prone to dealing with like a lot of things. Like, it's like, not that I'm saying like they put themselves in situations, but I would say sometimes they put themselves in situations.
Yeah.
And we all know people like that in our lives, not saying I'm a person like that or anything, but like, it's like a thing that's like things happen that are just like maybe not every day, like, because I feel like I'm also writing about like the daily lived experiences of these kinds of people. So like, right, like the day-to-day processes is like, I'm taking out the trash, I'm like unhappy, like I have to like make dinner, I kind of fucked it up, like I'm supposed to be taking my kid to and fro. This happened. And then also this thing happened. And it's like, oh, like, I think those things are like kind of essential inside of a household. Like, it's like they just happen. And there's these kind of like moments that are larger and they're just like the story inside of a household. And they kind of live there. They don't necessarily live inside of like anybody else's perspective. And it makes it a little easier to write into them, maybe, because like so many of the big things that happen in this book happen with inside the family.
Yeah.
And like things that happen inside of a family sometimes stay inside the family. If it happens in Vegas, I guess that's what I'm saying about families. Let's not apply this to like how families should work. But that I feel like that was like a lot of it, where it's just like, okay, these are like things like where it's like a regular kind of circumstances and then things kind of crop up as they do. Like, here's a big instance, but it's also inside of our household, and how is it contained there too?
And because you don't outline, was there a world in which the cat might have died?
Yes.
Did you
I am an animal lover. I think anybody who knows me knows I am obsessed with animals. But I was like, obviously this could have happened to the cat. I was like, I'm desperately not trying to have any kind of animals die in a book that I'm writing. Like, let's just like, as much as I might write about shitty people, I want to keep the animals alive. So maybe that's like what I'm going to consistently write towards.
Nice. Yeah, I love that. I love what you're saying about the drama of the family staying internal. And I think that that is one of like the most like gut-wrenching parts of the books, are those sections that are so private. Yeah. Should we do the last one now?
Okay, this is the longest one, so I did it in a different way. I think I saw someone asking about like what the different highlighting meant. I just did that for myself. I wish I was smarter and then I could say that I like they meant different things. When I'm editing, actually, like I usually choose like a different color topically as I go through. I'm not sure if I should answer this right now, but as I go through a draft, I'll choose like if there's big like sections or something that an editor wants me to look at, I'll choose like a different highlighting color for each theme. And then if I find a part that has to do with that, I'll highlight it. But this is not that. I just was using it for my own like personal, like trying to like highlight it so I can differentiate. But okay, let me share the screen and let's go through the last one. This is a scene between, okay, so we've moved forward in time. Here we can see here it's called Tex-Mex Teen Beer Dinner. It's a scene between Sammy and her son Samson. At this point in time in the book, we've moved forward and where Samson is a teenager. Like it's the summer before his junior year in high school. So Sammy has picked him up from swim practice. They have a convoluted relationship with each other, which they've always had. This is very long, so I won't try and like read this whole draft section to you, but I want to give you points of it because this was a section that was like changed in a number of different ways. So when we get to the point where it's edited, you'll see that the edits aren't highlighted. I've changed things that are changed into just the text is red. So you'll see that in terms of changes, because this had a huge scene added in. that I felt like really changed the trajectory of the book, which I think it was very significant in telling about who Sammy is, but also her relationship with Samson. So the two of them are at a Tex-Mex restaurant. She's decided, because she feels, because she doesn't know enough about her son, that she is going to, because he's like, let me have some of your beer. And so she's like, if I give you sips of beer, for every sip of beer, will you tell me a true thing about yourself? And he says yes. And so they're at this dinner, and she's getting progressively drunker as they're having this like dinner, like family dinner together. And she's trying to like pry information loose from him in this kind of way. So dysfunction, absolutely. But this is like what's happening here. So it starts off with her asking him questions about like his dating life and the way that her voice sounds that reminds her of her mother, who she does not have a relationship with. And they're eating, and she's frustrated with the way he eats, and like, you know, like this is like a use of money, it feels like a waste. He works at like a bowling alley, so she asks him about a girl there, and then there's this thing that happens where he's like after she asks him that, he like gags, and she like thinks he's choking, and then she gets mad at him and she says fuck you. She'd never spoken to her son that way before, but wow, did it feel good to say that aloud. I put a break in here because there's like some other stuff that happens here. So we move a little ahead in the scene. Truth, have you ever had a girlfriend or boyfriend, whichever? Like, he doesn't want to really answer. One sip per answer. And the server brings them more beers, and it went that way for the next half hour. He answered questions. Like, here's some things out of scene, right? Where it's like, kind of internalized, like here's what's happening, but like out of scene. She tells him a little bit about something that like her parents made her do, like gymnastics. And then, you know, she was drunk now, they're matching sips. She ordered 6 beers. Her son like says, let me drive. And then she's like, has this idea about like she's kind of drunk and like, oh, like, I'm a little like, I feel fondly about you, as many people have happened when they're thinking about drinking. Okay, so going into the edited version of this, any place you see red is like new text that's been inserted. Like, are you dating anybody? Gross mom. I wanted it to feel very much like this is like mother and son gonna get into it at this dinner together. And this is the stuff added here where it's like where she's thinking about her own mother. I wanted it to be like really like in her own mind for a moment, thinking about the ways in which she felt her own mom had failed her, or she didn't feel heard or listened to. And then like, this insertion, I don't want to be like her, thinking about her own mom. She thought taking a sip of beer as she considered how best to proceed. And then moving into the next paragraph, right? Like thinking about her son, it's a waste of money. He never appreciated how anything tasted. Why can't we just have burgers? Why do you have to make everything fancy? He complained when she bought them all expensive lobster tails as a treat, right? This idea where it's like, she has a lot of ideas about the ways her own mother has failed her. You don't hear me, you don't see me. Here she is, she's doing a lot of the same kind of stuff to her own kid, but she is like incapable of kind of actualizing that or seeing it. So adding that stuff in the scene felt significant to be like, okay, the character is reacting this kind of way because she has a lot of like baggage when it regards like her own mom, right? Like, here's how my own mom was. I hated that. Here's how I am. I'm doing the same thing to my own kid. That felt like an important part to put in here. And then this scene where it's like, what about the girl Britta from work? Her son, I very much like looked at the scene and I was like, let's take this in a little deeper. And my editor was like a great help with this. Or it's like, what do you want this scene to look like where he's gagging? Like, do you want him to actually be pretending to gag? Like, is he really choking? And then it was like, what if he was like pretending to gag when he hears this question, but then it turns into this thing where he's actually choking? And I was like, this is like a thing of like action where it's like, it felt like stakes were a little higher, but also like incorporated a lot of like still like frustration from Sammy. So it became one where it's like maybe he's just faking it the first time, but then like this time like where he's faking it and then oh no, it's actually turned into him kind of choking and Sammy has to move into like this very specific maternal role. And then it's like this fuck you, like fuck you. And then moving into this scene, back into the question. So it's like, have you ever had a girlfriend, boyfriend, whatever? I was like, what is the purpose of this? Like, what is she trying to do? She wants to get answers out of him. And part of that is like, who is she as a mother? What does she think about their relationship together? Like, who is she as a person? So adding in this what is she trying to do with this? Like, it's all fun and games to kind of sit down, like, and sit with somebody and be like, oh, 20 questions, this is her son. He's underage. They're at a restaurant. She's letting him have alcohol. Like, what does that look like? She wants to get answers out of him. So she relates this tidbit about how her parents made her do gymnastics. And then this insertion of just 2 lines of dialogue between the 2 of them. He says weird, and she says, yeah, I know. And these 2 lines of dialogue for me were like this kind of like commiseration between the 2 of them that was not present there before. Just yeah, and I know, right? Like where we, like almost like what you need from somebody, like when you're relating I'm just fucking going through some stuff. I just need somebody to say, oh, that's weird, that's messed up, and then be like, yeah, isn't that the worst? I was like, I need this here between the 2 of them, so that there can be some commiseration and some kind of like, not tenderness, but like this kind of like introduction into intimacy felt like really significant. And then directly below that, I added in a scene that to me feels like really important to the book as a whole. I added in like a truth question that was not there previously. Truth, she asked, what's your favorite color? Samson stared at her and then laughed. You're kidding, right? You don't know my favorite color. She sat for a minute and tried to think. He wore a lot of blue. Is it blue? He laughed again and rubbed his face with both hands like she was exhausting him. Mom, I've told you this a million times. Sammy shrugged. Maybe he was right. She was a terrible listener. Refresh my memory. I like green, he said, taking another sip of beer. Green like frogs, like Kermit the Frog. Her son made a low croak and she realized she was emulating frog noises. She listened a little closer and then the croak suddenly transformed into a bastardized, silly version of the Rainbow Connection. She burst out laughing. It was one of the funniest things she'd heard in a while. When was the last time she'd laughed with her kid, she wondered, and then she was about to cry. To me, working this in said so much about who they were with each other and how she perceives him. Because this is an opportunity in which she could have been like, I don't know my kid's favorite color. He's told me a million times. He's this old, he's a teenager, and I don't know the specific information about him. And her response was not that. It was, I feel sad for me. So I was like, okay, this is telling us a lot about this interaction and about like what she's going to pull from it, which is maybe not a great amount. But it felt important to do because it's also a moment where they are kind of touching, but in touching in ways where it's like, it's very fleeting. And that felt significant. And then, yeah, I wanted to have some things that as I left where it's like, she viewed him through her tears, like through the lights, like Christmas lights. And then like, it felt as if it had finally felt like they were connected, if only for a small moment. I was like, because this is a small moment in time, right? Like this is not some kind of be all end all about their relationship. They are having a small moment at a Tex-Mex restaurant over beers that he shouldn't be drinking and she shouldn't be giving him, but she's asking him questions that she should already know the answers to. And that really informed the scene. So adding that stuff in really did, I feel like, a lot of legwork. Okay, so I will stop my share now.
Just hearing you read that scene makes me like well up a bit. Their dynamic is so painful. But the edit, it's like brings this moment of relief, which I'm really glad is there, even if, as you say, it's partial. But I think my experience reading it was just like there hasn't been this moment in so long. So I didn't even really notice initially. Now that you've pointed out, though, I see that there was still kind of like a dark side to the moment.
Yeah.
But I was just so happy for her at the time. Um, I was curious, so we've kind of alluded to this a little bit before, but at this point, what was it like building Samson, and did it still feel like he was opaque to you besides, because we're so close to Sammy's point of view, did you do any like exercises to develop him externally from her?
Yeah, I mean, I actually thought a lot more about Samson as a character here as he was a teenager. And so much of that was because a teenager refuses to be in the kind of role that a child does a lot of the time, right? Where it's like this kind of idea of like on the cusp of adulthood, you have so many ideas about who you are as a person, what you believe, what you think about yourself, what you think about your parents and the people around you. Like this is like when you're like truly like developing yourself as like a person who's about to move into the world on your own, whatever that looks like, you know. So the secondary section, I mean, I guess it's technically the third section of this book, refused to let like Samson sit like quietly in the background. Like it's like, because I feel like the section where Samson is younger, like Sammy is like he gets to be quiet because I'm his mother, so I speak for him. But like moving into like having a teenager, like I speak for you doesn't work, right? Where it's like I speak for you. It's like no, you don't. Like you think you speak for me, but it's like you don't really have like an insight into what this is. So as I was writing this, it was a very kind of fraught feeling of moving through scenes where it was between Sammy and Samson, because I think they understand a lot of things about each other, but they also dislike a lot of things about each other, and they also don't understand a lot of things about each other. So those three things like happening in tandem and scene were the most fraught for me, like well outside of the relationship that Sammy has with her wife. um,
Mm.
the most tension for me came with like how she was interacting with her son, because it's like the two of them have such a feeling where it's like I know you, you know me, here's what we're gonna do, and they know just enough about each other to be dangerous, if that makes sense. Where
Yeah.
it really felt like I was like, okay, you guys know just enough about each other to be horrible,
Mm.
which I think is like a danger in like obviously in dysfunctional relationships. But like no, the Samson that happened in that section of the book, because he was older and because he was his own person. Like I wasn't obviously I'm still so close to Sammy.
Mhm.
That Samson doesn't get his own like perspective inside of it, but he sits there and he's constantly pushing, and I felt like that was important.
Yeah. Um, I also liked what you pointed out. I can't remember if this was in the first version or the second version, but the unreliability of the proximity to her talking about her mother and then doing exactly what she was criticizing. Um, and I love the subtle suggestions of unreliability throughout. But I also wanted to ask you about one of the more the one of the things that kind of really pushes it home, which are these like one-page inserts throughout the novel where you jump in to the perspective of another character. Um, Lenore from the cat scene being one of those people who gets a single page to kind of narrate her side of the story. Did you know, or what point of the drafting process did you know that you were going to include those?
Yeah. I got through the whole draft, just like done regular draft, and then one through for cleanup, just like fixing like typos and like, you know, any kind of like repeat words or anything like that. And as I was going through, I didn't want to add in the perspective of Samson or Monica, Sammy's wife, because I felt like as I was thinking, so much of this book to me is about the idea that everybody in a household is an unreliable narrator, as I've said. So like giving another person in the household a voice that was as close as Sammy's felt like I wasn't doing like good service to like what was happening. Cause it's like, yes, like maybe Sammy's version isn't right, but I'm not totally sure what right looks like inside of a household. So like giving Samson or Monica that kind of like upfront, like conversational viewpoint into the text felt like I was like, I'm giving you this, but you're just telling your own version. And so I was like, what I really, really, really want to see is like these very brief moments where someone who has literally no stakes in it, like no stakes in the game, no stakes inside the household, has like limited perspective of what's happening inside this family, giving a page or less introspection, like interstitial of like what that interaction had felt like and how they view the people. And that to me felt way more important because I was like, I feel like we're going to get more from somebody who like literally just doesn't know anything about anything, right? Like Lenore knows like bare minimum. The idea that like maybe like Samson's teacher when he's young, or like the neighbor having one, the lady that works at 7-Eleven, the woman who works at the church, the guy who is Samson's boss at the bowling alley, like these people, or the guy from the parking lot at the grocery store immediately after that Tex-Mex scene, are all people who have their own shit going on. It's the person on the other side of the gas station pump, I guess is like what I was saying earlier, right? Where it's like, we're here, we're at a moment in time. Your shit has nothing to do with mine. We're just touching right here. And like, what does it look like to me? And I was like, that's the most interesting to me. Like, I was like, I really want to know like what you see. And to me, that felt very informative in moving the text along as Sammy as, you know, unreliable throughout like a majority of this book, but also like sometimes reliable. Like sometimes the things Sammy sees are true. Sometimes the things Sammy sees are like, here's how I see it. But in other times where it's like, she's like, you see me this kind of way. And then the response from the person is like, I don't see you at all. It's that John Hamm, it's that Mad Men meme where it's like the guy in the elevator, it's like, I feel sorry for you. And then it's like John Hamm being like, I don't think about you at all. Which is like the kind of like mismatch of things. I was just like, I really need like some kind of like outside perspective to be like, how you see yourself is not necessarily how anyone else sees yourself. And that was very helpful to me. And also deeply fun to write, just as from a writer perspective, was very fun.
They're so fun. Like they're just like I remember the first like interruption, or experiencing the first of this interruption. I was like, oh, this feels like a twist. But you get it again and again throughout the novel. So the rewards of a twist spread throughout. Okay, I'll sneak in one more question before I go to the ones we have in the Q&A. But I wanted to ask, connected to that, the inserts, because I feel like they are kind of like a queer feature of the text, just like formally inventive. You've spoken about really wanting to write about the everyday, and I've heard you speak elsewhere about wanting to write about the everyday of queer experience specifically. And I wonder what it means to you to claim the title queer writer, and whether you've thought about what queer craft might mean.
I think I feel like I think about it a lot. It's like because as a queer person, I feel like it's just part and parcel of like who I am as a person moving through life. So it makes sense that it like informs me of who I am as a writer. Like not even just like how I write, but how I read, how like I interpret like art or like social media or like have interactions or intimacies or relationships. Like those things are very much informed by my queerness. So when I'm thinking a lot about writing, I am thinking a lot about like how queerness sits inside of the work. I mean, sometimes it's saying that stuff's subconscious, like it runs underneath, and I'm like, oh, there it is. I guess it's like I didn't know I was thinking that or something, which I think is like lots of us. But there's times too where I'm going through it where I'm thinking like, how does like, okay, like, because I think also queerness is like how it butts up sometimes, not all the time. I like heteronormativity, like how does it butt up against like where I sit in as terms of like a person who lives in a very conservative state. Like I live in Florida, I'm writing about Floridians, like how does queerness, you know, like smack up against things there. So this book is very much a way in which I was thinking about queerness in terms of like, there's queer spaces here, but they're like so informed by like what the state looks like and like what places look like and what's available to you. And so for Sammy in this book, it's like she's a queer person, she's had this coming out, she's like right, it's like this like delayed kind of adolescence where it's like you're like rediscovering who you are and how you relate to queer people and how you love and how you like make family and relationships. And then because there's no kind of like place to be like, okay, now you're queer and you have a kid, or you're trying to like be married, like how that feels like your family's leaving you, or your space, like your community like shrinks on you, and you feel like it's this kind of lonely space to be, or like what that looks like. So it became a way in which like, how am I looking at queerness in terms of the text? So for me, this was like, how is like, I'm looking at queerness as like a lack here.
Mm.
I want to look at it as a place where it's like, here's how I knew myself as a queer person, and now I don't know myself, and I don't have a community, and I am bereft. So that for me in this book was like a different way of looking at queerness, but it's like, I feel like it informs every way. I think it does inform everywhere I look at fiction, but also the things I read and just how I move through the world.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I love that thinking about queer loneliness or the absence of queerness as a form of queerness that's worth exploring. I feel like even the first scene with, it's just like when you go back and read the very first scene with the 911 call, there's that kind of absence of support system around her. It's just her desperately trying to find someone to like come to her aid. Okay, so I'm gonna read something from the chat.
Great.
The question says, seems like your revision process mostly adds detail and depth. How do you decide what to get rid of?
Oh, I think that's a really good question. I'm a person who, because I think everybody's like process for revision is super different. For me, I feel like I'm so gung ho about getting rid of stuff that I can be like a little hasty about it. I'm like, well, this is ugly, or this is like, this is kind of garbage, or like, this doesn't like, because I'm also of the very firm opinion of like, if I wrote something, I can write it again. Like you know, like I'm like, okay, I wrote this once, like I can trash it and then I can write something else. Like, you know, it's not finite. It's not a finite amount of like word count that I have for my brain or for like a Word document. Like I have time and space that I can like make more. It might look different, it might look the same. Usually what I choose to get rid of is I am a person who is extremely repetitive. And I'm going to say this as a librarian. I am a person who thinks about writing in terms of how I think about reference. And so I think about reference as like when someone comes up to ask you a question, you're not answering necessarily that question that they're asking you. You're trying to answer the question underneath the question, like the thing they don't know how to ask you. And when I think about fiction, a lot of the time I'm thinking about what I'm trying to get at the question. I'm like, I'm trying to figure it out for myself. So as I'm writing the question in 1,000 different ways. So because I'm trying to figure out the right way to ask it, because I don't know actually what I'm asking. So when I'm going through revision wise, it's like me doing a lot of cleanup of me asking the question the ways that don't feel like they fit inside of the narrative. It's like me doing a lot of like deletion of repetitive work, or like trying to like parse out like what I'm actually trying to ask, like about character, about like plot, about like place, about like theme. Like I'm like trying to ask the question so many ways, and I need to like get rid of some of those. Yeah.
I love the optimism of you know that you can write it again. I do not feel that way.
Maybe I can't, but I was like, I like to think that I could. Maybe it's Sagittarius in me. I'm like, I could maybe.
Okay, we'll do at least one more. Do you revise big picture plot chronology wise, or is it mostly on the scene level? Or if both, how do you flip back and forth?
I think I flip flop. So that's a good question. Usually as I'm writing, I'm really thinking like, because well, it's according to what I'm working on. If I'm working in like short fiction, which is very different, it's a very different animal, which I think about like short fiction inside of what I think of as like the snow globe, or it's like a little scene, like kind of like held and constructed in time, and it like exists inside of this little world. So when I'm revising inside of the snow globe or for short fiction, I am thinking about things on like a level that's like a little bit more intimate, if that makes sense, like on that kind of like construction. And then when I'm thinking about like revising with novel work, it requires so much more, because it's like it's much more expansive. It requires a lot more of your mind. It actually, for me, because I would never say what everyone would feel like. And for me, it feels like I'm like, here's as much as I can see, and I know the world is bigger of this novel. Here's what I can see right now. With the understanding that it is a bigger realm of existence that's sitting outside of what I can actually see at this moment in time. And I will move through it in terms of different ways. So different levels of revision, because here's the thing too, I think people do this in different ways. I always revise inside of a single document. So whatever that document is stays. It's like, here it is, it's concrete, at least for right now. And I know not everybody does that. And I love that. Like, I would never tell someone to do like what I'm doing. I don't think it's a right way or anything, but it is like the way that like my brain wants to parse it, where it's like, as I'm moving through each draft, like any decision I make is like a decision that's like anchored in time. Like, here it is, like, this is what's happening. And so it feels like, okay, making decisions based on, I will do different drafts. Like, I'll go through a pass of a whole novel being like, okay, we're going to look at it based on this. And then I'll do another novel based on, we're looking like the second pass, being like, looking at it based on this. And some of those things, like, even if I tell myself I'm doing like, okay, you're doing it based on this, some of those things work themselves out, right? Like, and that's like world wise, like, you know, like, okay, I'm telling myself I'm doing this. And as I'm working on it, it fixes some other stuff, or I think of it. Not, fixing is maybe not the right word, because I don't know if there's necessarily fixing in fiction, but like tuning it towards what I'm trying to do, maybe. Like if I'm doing like a pass and I'm like working on, like, I want to look at like the emotional relationship between two characters, and I'm going to think about this as I'm going through the pass, it might like actually inform the entirety, like thematically, about what I'm doing without me even thinking about it, if that makes sense.
Okay, I will sneak in one last one for the audience Q&A, and then I guess we'll call it a day.
This is so
fun. Let's see. What strategies do you use to get into the minds of your characters and let them guide the action?
I think it's according to like who it is. Sometimes I need like getting through a draft to like I'm figuring out who they are as I'm writing, or it's like how you get to know a person, like how you get to know a friend, or like, I hate to use this as an example, but like going on Tinder and you're like, I'm gonna meet someone, and then like getting to know like a literal stranger, right? Like, where it's like, okay, I'm finding out about you piecemeal, because it's like what you decide to reveal to me as a person, and then like what I like kind of like pry out of you, but also like, you know, like what is like a reveal through the course of like a friendship or relationship, or what does that look like? And sometimes that feels that way to me writing a draft. I'm trying to figure that stuff out as I'm going along writing fiction. I was like, I can't possibly know everything about you up front, for me anyway. Like, I can't do it. Like, I'm like there's no like sitting down and being like, here's like, I can kind of do like here's who I feel like this person looks like a little bit, like here's who, like, you know, like what feels important to them, like here's who they are, like here's your job, here's your like, you know, like your income, like, you know, like what your family looked like. You can do that kind of stuff. But for me, as I'm like moving through a book, I was like, the stuff that like people have inside of them is all very tender and like sits like deep in there. And like, right, people don't pick that up right away. Usually, like the stuff that's like that real like tender little meaty inside of the oyster, where it's like, you know, like you're trying to figure it out as you write. Like for me, that's how I feel like. So it's usually like as I'm going along through the book, I'm discovering a lot about a character. I feel like I'm uncovering a lot about it. So usually when I reach the end of a draft, I feel like I have like way more insight into who the characters are. And as I'm parsing back through like a revision, because I feel like I have a little more intimacy with that person, I'm able to like inform like editing decisions, where I'm like, okay, let me like add this, get rid of this, expand on something, because I have more insight into who that character is, because I've spent time with them and I've like developed a relationship with them in a kind of way where they've like revealed something to me.
Nice. I love that. That's good advice for fiction writing and for getting to know people in real life. This would be like therapy, so it came true. I guess We are a little bit over time, but I'm glad that we got that last one in. Thank you so much for doing this. I love this book so much, and it's such a pleasure and like very rare privilege to get to look at a writer's, rough draft. So I'm so grateful to you. Thank you.
I am grateful to you. I have had such like good editing experience with you. I already said to you, I was like, I feel like I was like, we're already like really good friends. I like pulled you into that with me. So it was like my pleasure to do this with you. Thank you for asking me.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for coming. I guess we'll sign off now. Thanks.